All right, good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Cold War. We're going to go over some different aspects, give it like a big picture, and then we'll, get more into it with more details in the next few. Don't forget, Mrs. Infanzon will be here on Thursday. So, having said that, I'm going to go through this quickly because I know I did this with you guys already in class. So I just put as a quick, as we go through. As you can see here, the Cold War is going to be exactly that. It's a Cold War. It means there's hostility, there's tension, but there's no actual war. There's no actual fighting. But it's going to basically be between the Soviets and the Americans, okay? And when I say this, it's going to be the communists against Western democracies and capitalism. That's what we're going to be looking at. So, what was it? So basically, as I said here, it's hostility between countries that doesn't actually go into war, or they might have skirmishes in other places with some of their satellite countries, but the two main countries do not fight, but they have tensions. And again, we go back to this, I'm just going to go fast because we've done this in class. The reason why the US and the USSR had been friends during World War II, they both had a common enemy, Germany. Once Germany's defeated, what happens is these two who had not been friends in the 20s and the 30s, but became friends because of Germany, are now going to start pulling back away because they're wondering, okay, what's going to happen next? And some of this is going to go back into World War II and what was happening. And one of the things that's going to take place here is, 45 is going to change the world. We've got concentration camps. We've got the atomic bomb. So how is that going to play out with atomic diplomacy? And then basically, how would these two nations, the Soviets and the Americans, basically divide the world? Eventually, they'll go. So, as you can see here, and I think we talked about this, but basically the USSR had been established in 1917. There was a lot of friction between the West and the Soviets because they were communist, and that's very antithetical of what the West was about, which was more about freedom and so forth. And during this time, as the war goes on in World War II, one of the things that happens is because the United States, and I say the United States mostly because they're the ones who are going to lead the Allies during World War II for the most part, and they're the ones who are going to be leading most of the West. There was a belief that by Stalin that we were trying to bleed the Russians red, just bleed them dry, so that the United States in the West could just move into Eastern Europe, into Russia, and get rid of the communists. And that's what he thought, we were trying to get the Germans to do. So what happens is when the war ends, as you can see here in red, all of this in red is going to fall under basically Soviet communist rule or their sphere of influence. And what happens is Stalin really wanted, especially this part of Eastern Europe, to be there as a buffer just in case there are any future wars. Remember, there was a war in 14, and then there's a war in 1939. It's, only 20 years later. So he's got, a real reason to think that. As we can see here, we did this in class. You guys remember doing this? Yes. You got this. Good. I'm going to move on then. If you weren't there that day, sorry. And now going back to the Yalta Conference. Now, do you guys know who the big three are? Finally? Okay, so the big three. Churchill, England, Roosevelt, United States, Stalin, Soviet Union. Though these three are kind of enemies, these two especially, Churchill and Stalin really are staunch enemies. It's the one in the middle, Roosevelt, who kind of kept this relationship intact. But what's going to happen is on April 12th, last week literally, 1945, he dies. When he dies, now you've got a brand new president coming in, and that, I'm sorry, I'm teaching? Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So, and I'm being recorded. Yeah. Okay, sorry. So Roosevelt's going to die, and then Churchill is going to be knocked out of power. And when that happens, what ultimately happens, the only man left here is Stalin. So some of the agreements that they came to in Potsdam and so forth is going to be really when Attlee from England and Truman from the United States get together with Stalin, they're going to be like, well, you sure you made those agreements? There's not a lot of trust, and you don't know really what was happening. So one of the things that's going to happen is that they're going to say the Soviet Union would come in and help fight over in Japan. It's going to be a while. I don't know how long you want to stay. Okay. And the second thing is that they were going to create the United Nations. And by doing this, they were going to give 5 members, 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, England, France, and China, and they all would have the ability to veto. One veto is all you need to destroy any kind of United Nations resolution, okay? They established it in San Fran, but they headquartered it in New York City. They also agreed that Poland would have free elections and that Germany would be split into 4 zones: the United States, the Soviet Union, the British, and the French. So this is all the things that they agreed with at Potsdam. But these are the big 3 at the time. What happens is there's a new big 3. Excuse me, that was Yalta. Did I say Potsdam? I meant to say Yalta, sorry. The kid kind of got me a little off. So at Potsdam, we got a new 3 that come in, and here's the problem is, now there's another person who hates Stalin. Truman was not a communist, was not a lover of communism at all. So there's already this dislike. They don't really get anything accomplished, but Stalin will say to Truman, basically, look, I know you got a bomb. And you didn't know you had a bomb until you became president, but I already knew. Because we have spies within your government. And this is going to kind of rattle Truman just a little bit. And basically, this is going to continue to the war is not over yet. This is going to continue to push into the Cold War from World War II, that you have 3 men who really don't have much trust. And Winston Churchill is going to give a famous speech in Missouri that says, an iron curtain has descended upon Europe. And you've seen this picture before, right? Yes. You guys remember doing this? Okay, I'm going quick in this part here. Questions so far? All right. So what happens now is this. As things are emerging, the United States, again, leading it, they're trying to play chess, as you can see here. This is like a game of chess. They're trying to figure out, okay, you're making a move, I've got to make a move and be 1 or 2 steps ahead of you. So what's happening is they're thinking to themselves, well, wait a minute here. Soviets are communists. They're kind of pushing communism into Eastern Europe. At the same time, China's going through some instances where they're looking, Mao is looking to bring them to communism. You've got Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam looking to bring them into communism. You've got the Koreans looking to go into communism. So what it looked like it was, communism was starting to spread. So what they came up with is by George F. Kennan. He basically says, look, to try and fight and defeat all these people is going to be impossible. It's going to be deadly, it's going to be costly. So let's do the next best thing, contain it. Containment policy. If we contain communism where it is, it won't spread any further. And if it can't spread any further, then we don't have to worry about it. We can keep it there. Think about like the pandemic, right? Like if we can get people inside of their homes and keep the disease from spreading, we know it's there, but once it's there, we can contain it. That's why they had all of those, quarantines and stuff, right? And that's what they're trying to do. The British also are going to ask the United States to keep Greece free, because they need Greece to be free for economic reasons, and to keep the Suez Canal open so that they can do their shipping from all over the world. Don't forget, the British still control India. And out of this is going to come the Truman Doctrine, named after President Truman. And it's known as the domino theory. Have you heard of this before?
Yes.
So the domino theory goes back to containment. It's kind of like this, right? And if you look at the picture, it says it right here. Well, If China goes and they hit Korea and Vietnam, then it's going to go to Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and what's going to happen is it's all going to start falling over like one big domino set. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to contain it. So in here, they're going to come up with the Truman Doctrine, and basically what's going to say is that, again, they're going to try in the West to contain communism from pushing forward. Any questions so far? All right. Out of this is also going to come the Marshall Plan. Have you heard of this? The Marshall Plan? Okay, so the Marshall Plan is going to be named after George C. Marshall, who was the Secretary of State. He was also one of the leading generals in the Second World War. Out of this, he's looking at the future, and he says, one of the things that's going to make the West popular, it's going to make the West more viable for these other people, is to rebuild their nations. And A, it's going to do two things. It's really going to, boost our economy here in the United States in the, late 40s and 50s. But it's also going to rebuild Europe. And by rebuilding Europe, what's going to happen? Are they going to want to go communist, or are they going to want to stay more capitalist and free? Capitalist and free. So this is his thinking. And so what he does is, they offer to rebuild Europe, which we do, and we also offered it to these Eastern European countries, but they all refused. They kind of had to refuse. Stalin put the pressure on them and said, no, you cannot take that money. So what happens is we're going to rebuild Europe under the Marshall Plan, and this is going to bode well for us because it's going to make us more popular and solidify allies in Western Europe. Some other issues. Have you heard about the what was going on in West and East Berlin? Yes? No? Okay. So real quickly, as you can see here, when they divided East or Germany, they divided it. You had East Germany here, which was the Russian zone, the British, the French, and the American zones. Well, what happened is these three zones eventually united and became Western Germany, a free, democratic, more capitalist society. And East Germany went ahead and it became communist. But here's the problem. What's inside of East Germany?
Capital.
Berlin. Berlin had been divided into 4 parts. So what happened is the United States, England, and France united their 3 parts, and they now had a free half of the city where the other half was communist. What do you think a lot of people wanted to do? Leave. Why would you want to leave? Communism, freedom. Not a lot of opportunity to make money, lots of opportunity to make money. So what happened is a lot of people were fleeing. So what Stalin tries to do is he says, okay, we're just going to shut down the rail, the train tracks that come in, the train lines into East Berlin. So if you can't supply them, they're just going to have to turn and become, part of all of Berlin and become communist. Well, what happens is Truman and the United States say, the heck with that, and we do the Berlin airlift. And you've heard of that before. Yes? You guys know that. So what happens here is basically the United States will be, and the British will be supplying West Berlin, and eventually Stalin realizes that it's a waste of time and that he's going to have to do something else, okay? Everybody's good? All right. Like I said, this is just a quick overview of this. And as you can see here, this was East Berlin, and you can still see, this was taken back probably in the 60s or 70s, but literally, look at the West and the East, and they meet right there. Standing right next to each other, for their nations. It's interesting how that works right there on the border. Look at Korea. Other issues. So out of all of this now, the United States is starting to realize that if they're going to contain the Soviets and communism, they also have to create some sort of a treaty alliance just in case a country's attacked. You've heard of NATO? Okay, so they're going to create NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And out of this, there will be 12 nations that will be part of it. As you can see, they're here in blue against the red, which is going to be the Warsaw Pact of the Soviets. And NATO is basically as if anybody from the Warsaw Pact attacked anybody in the NATO alliance, then all of NATO would join in to fight the fight. Hence what we got going on today. What's happening over in Ukraine? Why did Putin invade Ukraine?
Ukraine was going to join NATO, or was in the process of joining NATO.
They were in a possible process of joining it. There was being leaked around that the United States was inviting Ukraine to join, and Putin had said that if that happened, that that they would not take that lightly. So I'm not saying that he's right in what he's doing, but as you can see, what took place from the 40s is still playing a role 70, 75 years later, give or take a couple of years, okay? Any questions on that? So far, everything's good? All right. Other issues. So we're also going to pass the United States National Security Act, which will eventually lead to our CIA. You've heard of the CIA, right? They do really good. I'll leave that alone there, yeah? But another thing that's going to come out of the Second World War is going to be called an arms race. What happens with the arms race? Want to explain it to me?
Basically, both powers are vying for more powerful weapons, and as one side gets more powerful, the other side being weaker, one has to build up their strength. It's just going back and forth.
You had the atom bomb, we get the hydrogen bomb. Well, we get the next one level up, and then you, and you, and you, and you, till eventually you have so many weapons that it's mutual annihilation. You attack me, I attack you, and everybody's annihilated. The world is over. And that's what happened, is that there was this huge buildup. And with this, now when there's a tension, it was a lot different even, in the early 40s, even during the Second World War. Even though there was real war happening, at least there wasn't mutual annihilation as a possibility. As they start moving along, it's going to turn into the possibility of the world being totally destroyed. And then what's going to happen is they're going to build better rockets, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that are going to be able to fly to different places. And if you ever look at a map, everybody thinks like if you're looking, here's the United States, if you're looking at a globe this way, the United States, here's the Soviet Union, that's a long way to fire, right? No, just go right over the top, right over the pole. That's all you have to do. We're a lot closer than people think. Let me see if you can see. Well, it's hard to tell, but if you really, as you get closer, don't forget, this part and this part are much closer than you think if you just go straight up over the poles. So, yeah. Then we get to Korea. What have you learned about Korea? Anything? Not much? All right, so let me get into Korea then. So what happens here is the Cold War will really heat up in Korea. So remember, like I said, the Cold War is the United States and its allies with the Soviet Union and their allies, and these two kind of like, they're going back and forth with words and propaganda, but they're not really fighting. But in this case here, some of the satellite areas are going to get into a war. And the United States will join this war, and the Soviets will help back this war, but they're not really fighting each other face to face. Does that make sense? So what happens is, when China went communist in '49, except for Taiwan, which is why it's important what's going on with Putin, we're now wondering what's going to happen with Taiwan. Because for the longest time, Taiwan was considered the only government that we in the West recognized was in Taiwan. We never recognized the Chinese communists until years late, decades later. So what's happening now is, we're being scared again. Okay, here's the domino theory. Here it is, it's coming in. And what happened is when Korea was freed by at the end of World War II, basically you had kind of the communists and the Russians coming in from the north, the Americans and the capitalists coming in from the south. They met at the 38th parallel. The country was divided into two: communism, freedom. But they had been, on that border. So what happens is North Korea went ahead and they basically invaded South Korea. When that happened, all that could, happen is that the United States stepped in to stop communism from spreading, to help the South Koreans from becoming communist, and we now have a police action, a war, call it what you want, but we have an issue. And it's called the Forgotten War because most people go from World War II to Vietnam and don't talk much about Korea because it's pretty much a stalemate by the end. Long story short, the North Koreans are going to drive way deep into South Korea. The United States and their allies are going to then push them all the way back up almost into China. So the Chinese get involved and they send their people in, and so it pushes back down, back and forth, to eventually it settles right around that 38th parallel, okay? And so what's going to happen is, during this whole war, is both sides are going to go up and down the peninsula, but nobody is going to win. It's pretty much a tie, because now they're negotiating a peace. And what happened is, well, it gets real crazy here, but going through it, MacArthur, who had been the Pacific commander, wanted to go up and bomb China, use the the weapons that we had. He and Truman got into an argument, and MacArthur questioned Truman, so Truman fired him, and got all this other stuff. But what comes out of the whole thing is, at the 38th parallel, we now have a DMZ, a demilitarized zone. And this is one of the most heavily fortified zones in the entire world. And right here, you see that right there? That is the dividing line. So this is North Korea, this is South Korea here, and these two stare each other down. And basically, are you going to put your strongest or your weakest soldiers there? Strongest, right? Because you want to look very strong. In 2018, 19, President Trump did actually meet Kim Jong-un, who is the leader of North Korea. They met there, and they both stepped over each side of that border. That was the first time that had ever happened. So some strange things still going on in the Koreas today. But it's all part of this containment. This is important. Contain, contain, contain. Communism can't go anywhere. It's got to stay where it is and no further. And what's going to happen towards the end of the war is Joseph Stalin is finally going to die. Rest in peace. See ya. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that, should I? Yeah, I should. He was not a nice man. He killed, a lot of people think Hitler, Hitler definitely killed a lot of people. Stalin probably killed about 30 to 40 million people. He killed a lot more than Hitler, but we don't talk about it much. But anyway, so the 50s for the most part are going to be kind of calm, relatively speaking. It won't be until the 60s that we're going to start seeing a serious uptick in issues when it comes to Cuba, the Berlin Wall, going into Vietnam, the space race that begins in the 50s and really continues into the 60s. So with the death of Stalin, there's going to be a cooling in Europe especially. And the man who takes over, Khrushchev, he's going to be like, all right, let's reassess what's been going on. Because they're finally not living in the fear of Stalin. Because Stalin had that much power to just literally murder anybody he wanted. And I'm not making that up. So, what's going to happen here is, have you guys heard of the Bay of Pigs?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Did you guys go into it a lot?
Not really, no.
No, okay. So what are the Bay of Pigs? Does anybody know who this is?
Castro.
That's Fidel Castro, right? And so if you look here, here's Key West, so here's the United States, okay? They're going up into Florida. Here's Cuba, so that's, roughly about 90 miles away, is what they usually say, might be, whatever. 90 miles away. And if you look at Cuba, down here is a place called the Bay of Pigs. So what happened is this, Castro had come in, he had, obviously was a Cuban, he lived there, and he overthrew the Western-backed government of Batista. And when he did this, he basically starts a revolution in Cuba. And with this revolution, they're going to go from being, I won't say they were free, I would say they were friendly to the West. And they weren't democratic, but they weren't communist. And that's another important thing. even if you're a dictatorship hurting people, your own people, as long as you are not a communist, we were more willing to back and support you, even if you acted more like a dictator. It was the communism we were after. So when Castro comes in, he leads his revolution, and as he comes in, he takes over the country, turns it to communism. Many Cubans fled to Miami. Hence, if you've ever been to Miami, you know there's a huge Cuban population down there, Little Havana and so forth. So what happened is now is there's a plan to overthrow Castro, because this is 90 miles away. We don't like that. We're not used to having things like this on our border. Mexico's not been an issue. Canada's not been an issue, but now we've got an issue. We don't like that. And there's also stuff going on down here in South America we will talk about, some different kinds of communist movements. So what happens is we decide that we're going to overthrow them. The plan is to send in Cuban exiles with the help of American planes coming over the top to give them, cover, that we were going to land these Cubans, exiles here. We were going to give them cover. They were going to get up into the woods and stuff, get other people to follow them, overthrow the government, and then there goes communist Cuba. But it fails because the United States did not send the air support that it promised. So these poor people were captured and tortured and you name it from there. And what happens is this is a big, big, big embarrassment for the United States and for John F. Kennedy, who was the president, the youngest president we had ever had at this time, a Catholic, which was the first Catholic this country had ever had, and out of Massachusetts. So there, he was young and energetic, but people were still a little bit wishy-washy on him. So this didn't look good for him. But what eventually happens here in Berlin, and I'll never forget the night the wall came down. That was an incredible night. I was a freshman in college. What happens is remember how I told you you've got East and West Berlin? What are the people in East Berlin doing?
Trying to escape.
Not trying, not just trying, but they are. And so, this doesn't look good. It's like everybody's like, yeah, we hate you so much, we're going to go this way. Well, it doesn't look good for the communists and the Soviets. So they decide to literally divide the city. And one day they literally put down, people went to work, they came out of work, and there's barbed wire fence going down the middle of the city along the border. And then over a series of time, they built the wall. And the wall is probably no thicker than about this, right here. Like a regular cinder block. Have you guys seen the width of a cinder block?
Yeah.
It's about that wide. And it was probably as tall as about, where the ceiling is, maybe a couple feet higher. But that gives you an idea of it. But it stretched the whole city. And so, literally what happened is, on this wall, they went ahead and actually, as you can see here, they put, whatchamacallits up there, guards up there, to go ahead and make sure that they kept their people in East Berlin. And they would actually shoot the people if they got near the wall. And you could tell this is the western side simply because there's all graffiti. You could go up to it. President Kennedy went to the wall in 1963, and he gave a very famous speech. And in this speech, at the end, he's talked about, I am a citizen of the world, I am a this, I am a that. And then he said, Ich bin ein Berliner. And what he wanted to say is, I am a Berliner. I am like you. I am from Berlin. I want freedom. The problem is when you do this, you don't do the bin. You just do Ich ein Berliner. But when he said, Ich bin ein Berliner, he literally said, I am a jelly donut. That's literally what he said. So another embarrassing thing for him. Of course, the people knew. This is a little aside. I like to tell these things about history because they're kind of interesting. But that is literally what President Kennedy said in front of the Berlin Wall in 1963. I am a jelly donut. After this, we're now going to have another serious situation called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because now Castro is A, frustrated about what happened, you tried to take him out. Now he's also become even tighter with the Soviets. And so now the Soviets are sitting there going, wait a minute here. NATO and Western Europe, they're right on our border along the Eastern European communist nations with all of their weapons and so forth. The United States has nothing like that. What if we move our actual warheads, nuclear warheads, into Cuba and now pressure the United States some? So they do. And so what happens is this turns into the Cuban Missile Crisis. And literally, we came to the brink of war. People that I know who lived here at the time, who back in the 60s, who were, obviously much older than I am, they literally remember coming down US 1 were Army military trucks with all their weapons and stuff headed towards Key West, towards South Florida, to prepare for any invasion, to prepare for any kind of war. They really thought we were going to be this close to being at war, which thankfully it never happened. And what happened is eventually, the United States said that no ships could come into Cuba, you could not deliver anything, and so what happened is, as it got close to the brink of war, it was going to be like, you ever hear like playing chicken? Two people playing chicken, like you're both driving at each other, who's going to blink first or who's going to move? Well, Khrushchev blinked first, and he didn't put those weapons in. Later on, it was found out that he blinked, or he didn't send those weapons in because Kennedy had agreed to remove specific missiles out of Eastern Europe area, like around the Greece, in that region there, that he was moving nuclear warheads out of there. So it was kind of like, you do this for us, we'll do this for you, and then we move on. But it came very close to war. Oh, it was Turkey, not Greece. Sorry, I knew it was Turkey. I was close. My mind's a little slow today. And then we turn to Vietnam, probably one of the most famous pictures taken during the Vietnam era. This is at a march in Washington, D.C., a protest against the Vietnam War. Have you guys talked much about Vietnam?
Oh, we did last year.
You did last year, okay. So, Vietnam is one of those wars that goes from about 58 to 75, depending on how you want to mark it, because you could even go earlier, when Ho Chi Minh is trying to make all of Vietnam free from the French, because it was French Indochina. It could also be that, you could look at it that, when he pretty much invades into South Vietnam. I mean, there's a lot of ways of going with it. But one thing about this era is that it's going to change the West and it's going to change the United States drastically. The baby boomers, you've heard of the baby boomer generation, right? You guys are always at war with them, I hear. The millennials against the boomers. You guys millennials? No, I guess it's the millennials that are always against them. We're in between going, oh, you two get along. Anyway, so this is Allen Ginsberg, and basically said, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. And what's going to happen is this war is going to turn America into something very different. And I don't think we've ever recovered. And some people can say that's for the better. Some will argue it's for the worse. It depends on your political outlook and how you see the world today. But no doubt about it, this war is going to change the West and change the West forever, at least up to this point here. So, what happened here? This is Ho Chi Minh up here on the top. And here's Indochina. It was known as French Indochina because it was controlled by the French at this time. It was still a colony. More or less, Ho Chi Minh said at the end of the war, and even at the end of World War I, he went to Versailles and said, hey, can you just walk away? Give us our country. Let us become who we want to become. It didn't happen. And over time, he became communist. But here's the problem with the United States and communism. We think all communism is the same. So the Soviet communism is the same as the Chinese communism, is the same as the Vietnamese, and they were different. They had, even though it's the same system, think about this. There's freedom in America, and then there's freedom in say, England. They're similar, but they're not the same, are they? And that was it. We didn't see the difference. So what happens is, Minh, as time goes on, becomes more and more of a communist. And basically, at the end of the war, he goes again and says, can you get the French out of here? The French refused to leave Indochina, as it was called then. And with that, Ho Chi Minh decides to have a fight against the French government. And again, what are we worried about? Communism what?
Spreading.
Spreading. So what's kicking in?
Domino effect.
The domino theory of and containment. So see how this is all, that's that theme we're going through today. You guys seeing it okay, right?
Yeah.
So what happens here is this is Diem. No Din Diem. And I don't always say my Vietnamese names properly. I try. It's no being mean. I have a hard time with some words. So as you can see here, here's the 17th parallel. Here's North Vietnam. Here's South Vietnam. And so what happens is as Ho Chi Minh and his army comes in to South Vietnam, they defeat the French, and at the same time, what happens is the United States kind of jumps in only because the French have been our allies. They're a Western power. We kind of have a lot of similarities, so we back them. And what we do is we put Diem. We kind of support this man. He was a tyrant. He was awful. He was Catholic. Not that it makes him awful, but he was Catholic, which was not the majority religion there in Vietnam. And by backing him, again, I said, we back people as long as they're not what? Communist. That was the most important thing. So what happens is we backed him. However, as the Communist Party became more and more popular in South Vietnam, and it's going to be known as the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong. Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
So what happens is they do this. What's going to happen is you're going to have more and more issues taking place in Vietnam, and now they need help from the West to fight these communists. So we're going to send in advisors. These are people who go in and help train the Vietnamese army, the military, to prepare. At the same time, we also were doing some covert operations and so forth. And we also started to lose some people. I think the first guy for America died in 1959. And again, why are we involved? Well, domino theory. 2, ignorance. Again, we thought all communism was the same. I shouldn't use the word hate, it's probably not the word, but China and the Soviet Union, they work with each other, but they definitely have very different issues in who should be the world leader as we're moving forward. There's an arrogance by the West. I mean, these are Vietnamese people. Oh my God, they're from the jungle. I mean, these people, they can't win. Look at our superiority. That's part of it. And last, again, if I'm anti-communist, I'm more likely to win an election in the United States. And let me ask you a question. Do politicians really care about you? They just care about getting reelected so they can do what? Because you tell me how you make $150,000 a year, and after 3 years, you're a multimillionaire. You explain that to me, because I can't. Yeah, right? I'm not that bright to do that. So, what happens here is, oh, by the way, do you know what this is? Did you ever see this picture? Yeah. And I mean, literally, they would just set themselves on fire to protest the war. So long story short, John F. Kennedy, President Eisenhower will send troops there, very little at first as advisors. John F. Kennedy starts to send more, but he's lying to the press and saying, oh no, we're not doing anything over there. No, it's all lies. You're not really hearing things correctly. But we were definitely sending them there. By '63, the CIA realizes that Diem from South Korea needs to go. South Vietnam needs to go. So he's assassinated. Okay? Not too long after that, Kennedy's assassinated because Kennedy was probably going to pull us out of that Vietnam War. And what happens walks in a new person. His name is LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Have you heard of him? So I want you guys to understand, because you're probably thinking, how does this all work together? Well, what's going on also in America in the late 50s and 60s? Civil rights movement. These are all playing together with each other. These aren't like, that's happening over there and this is happening over here. And these movements, these anti-war movements, are going to also involve the civil rights movements, because now it's going to be, well, freedom for women, feminism, freedom for blacks, that's, civil rights, freedom. And it's all playing together, so it's all coming to a head, and that's why, like I said, it changes the United States. What happens here? Don't ask me why that's doing that. I didn't know that was doing that, sorry. Go back to him. So basically what happens is, Johnson, in 64, the USS Maddox was bombed off the coast of North Vietnam, instead of Korea a lot today. It's known as the Gulf of Tonkin. When that happens, basically, Lyndon Baines Johnson says, hey, you know, what are we going to do here? And so Congress pretty much gave him a blank check and said, you know, you're the commander-in-chief, do what you got to do, move the troops there, do what you got to do. Since then, a lot of presidents have taken over kind of the power of the American Congress from being able to truly declare war. If you go and start looking, you'll see that, which is scary because that has ramifications. During Johnson, we're going to go from being somewhat involved and almost starting to pull away under Kennedy to all of a sudden just ramping it up, and we went from troop movements like this to all of a sudden just skyrocketing who's being sent there. And the numbers of troops sent to Vietnam, it was astronomical. We're also going to go ahead and we're going to start Operation Rolling Thunder, where literally they just figured we could just bomb them into submission. Didn't work. It pretty much failed. And it also made enemies of, again, people who could have been your friends. I go back and use this as a similarity. When the Germans came into Russia, Ukraine area, they had a lot of Ukrainians who did not like the Soviets, and they could have been allies, or at least friendly enough to help each other. But the Germans were like, oh, you're Slavic, you're different, kill them. And it's the same thing here. We took people that could have been allies, or at least not a worry, and almost turned them anti-American, anti-West because of the bombing and some of the things that we did. And little by little, we will start to slowly really get into this war. And what happens is we were built to fight the Soviets in Europe, not the guerrilla warfare that's going to take place in Vietnam, in the jungles. Absolutely. Here's some famous pictures. Have you seen these before? Yes, no? So you know, napalm, that's a sad picture there. This helicopters are going to be important. I don't know if they talk anything, if you need to talk anything about like weaponry or what's the word? I just lost it. What's that? Not artillery, technology. That's the word, technology. This is important because the helicopter is going to change this war. You can move troops pretty quickly, go up and down and so forth, but you can also move people who are seriously injured out of the battlefield, and more men will survive because of this, okay? But some really sad pictures up there. 1968 becomes very pivotal for many, many reasons. But one of them is called the Tet Offensive. More or less, the Tet Offensive. T-E-T means New Year in the Vietnamese language, okay? So it's their New Year. When this happened, they basically, all over Vietnam, they basically, the North, the communists, attacked the Americans in the West. It was a great show. I mean, it looked good. It seemed great. But basically, it was like, you know, if somebody got punched, they kind of stabbed them back, but then they just walked forward and started beating up the other person. That's what happened. The United States was kind of caught off guard, but then all of a sudden they came right back, and they were able to, you know, win all the different battles. But what happened is, when this happens, Walter Cronkite, who was Mr. News, if he said it, take it to the bank. Believe it. This is where the media is really going to play a big role in what happens. He basically comes out and says, really, I thought we were winning. If we're winning, how can they do this kind of an attack on us? And people started to really rethink what is actually happening over in Vietnam. And with this, people, again, the anti-war movement's going to ramp up even more because of it. And also what's happening is, for the first time really in history, it's become a television war. People came home from work, they literally sat down, they got up sometimes either their meal or their TV dinners, literally, and they sat there and they watched the news while they were eating. They never, when World War II reels were sent, they were sent to the movies, and they were highly edited. They made sure they never showed dead faces of Marines. They always tried to be positive. This is actually in your face, and people are seeing it. And because of this, what's going on here? And then literally, we started to lose our stomach, and then William Fulbright basically said, you know, we can't win this war. And with this, you're going to see a huge push to get us out of war. The other thing that's going to happen is called the My Lai massacre. And in this massacre, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, and again, when you see the word gook up there, it's not, I'm using the words that they would have, and that's how they're looking at these people. And again, instead of possibly making them be allies, they kind of turn some of these people into, you know, enemies. And what happened is, during this, pretty much, it was a Viet Cong stronghold, so definitely these people were anti-American in many ways, but still, they're civilians. And, you know, we've always had that belief that you're not supposed to kill civilians. Well, with this, more or less, Charlie Company goes in, they rape women, they shoot them, they put them in a ditch, they kill them. This is where, you know, this gets out to the news, and this is shown across the TVs and across the newspapers and stuff, and out of this comes Baby Killer. Talk real quick, my uncle, who was in Vietnam 3 tours, when he landed back in San Francisco and got off his plane and is walking through San Francisco, literally there were people there holding signs and spitting on him as if he had been a baby killer. That's what they were calling him. So again, you know, that sometimes the little, you know, it becomes the whole. So that's also going to turn people's stomachs and so forth. Another thing that happens is, in 1968, LBJ decides not to run for president because he would have been defeated, so he knew that. Richard Nixon, he comes out. He had been the vice president under President Eisenhower. He becomes the Republican nominee. He wins the election, and he basically says, I want to end this war with, what's the term he wanted to use here? Honorably, that's it. He wants to end it honorably. And so with this, people thought he really kind of like extended the war, but what was happening is the North Vietnamese would send their people on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they would basically were outside of the zone that we were fighting in. So Nixon said, well, heck with that, if you're going to do that, we're just going to start bombing you over there and doing that and so forth. It didn't go very well because it seemed like he was escalating the war. There's a war protest. Just everything was going bad. And so by basically 1970, year I was born, there's huge protests, big protest in Kent State University. 4 students are killed during this protest. It got real ugly. See how this is all playing a role now? Okay. And by 73, the United States starts pulling out of Vietnam. And by 1975, this was the embassy in Saigon. All these people were trying to get onto the last helicopter as it was leaving. Do you remember seeing the pictures of people coming out of Afghanistan about a year ago? Yeah. People have made the same kind of reference and that same type of thing, you know, where people are hanging on to like the wheel wells of airplanes and falling out of the sky because they just wanted to get out because they were so afraid that they would be tortured and killed and so forth. With this, the war is pretty much over. Vietnam becomes all communist. President Carter, he basically, all the draft dodgers that had left and gone to Canada, they are basically pardoned. And in 1982, they opened up the Vietnam Wall Memorial. And actually, my father's cousin, so I guess it'd be my cousin too, he's up on this wall. He was killed in '66. So that's still there, because you can see that in D.C. Then the policy, I'm almost done. The policy of the 1970s, you've got Richard Nixon. This is his Secretary of State. Have you heard of Henry Kissinger? A little bit. So Henry Kissinger was actually born in Germany, but he will become our Secretary of State. Well known, very bright man, very well connected, especially in Europe and so forth. And basically, he's going to do everything he can to try to bring the Chinese and the Americans together. And his philosophy is, the ends justify the means. So hey, if we get what we want out of it, doesn't matter how we did it, as long as we get what we want. So you can say that's good or bad. It depends on your moral outcome. So that's why he's not afraid to support dictators. Out of this is going to come détente, and then we're going to get more into this later, but détente, and we're going to make some agreements with the Soviets where we're going to do the SALT agreements, where we're going to start limiting the number of missiles that we have in our arsenal. What's also going to happen is Kissinger's going to go to China. He's going to do very well there. He's secretly there. Everybody thinks everything is going well. When he comes back, Nixon decides to visit. And with this, we have this reopening between China and the United States. And this is when there's some thawing out between the Chinese and the Americans in the West when it comes to communism and so forth. And what else do I have for you guys? And then eventually the Middle East. Have you guys heard about the Middle East at all? How this is blown up? So also during the Cold War, the Middle East is really going to blow up. Here is Israel in yellow, as you can see here. Israel had been part of Palestine, or is in Palestine, and it had been controlled by the British after World War I, when the Ottoman Turkish Empire fell apart. The British went ahead and at the end of the war said, after seeing what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust in the concentration camps, said, you need your own home. So we basically gave them this country. With that, you now had people who had been settled there for generations, and out of this comes a lot of conflict. Israel declares itself a nation in 1948 and is literally at war that day. When Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria attack it, the United States backed it. And as time goes on, the United States has always backed and supported the Israelis because it's really the only democracy in the Middle East. So and then also we want to try to keep as much peace there because of why? Oil. Oil is huge, right? And out of this, you're going to get the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat. And I'm going to go into more detail some of this stuff. Also, Israel has been at war pretty much since it became a nation. They go into the Yom Kippur War. And with this war, their OPEC is going to limit the amount of oil. And I remember this because I remember being a kid in lines like this with my father, waiting to get gasoline because there wasn't enough gas, and the price was like through the roof. It went from like 15 cents to like 35 cents, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but that was huge. Okay, that was huge. And so basically, this is when the United States and other countries start looking at ways of maybe becoming a little bit more energy independent. And last but not least, I think this is the last thing, is under Jimmy Carter, we did bring some peace to the Middle East in the Camp David Accords. When Israel and Egypt, Sadat and Begin, they basically shake hands and agree not to go to war with each other anymore. But basically out of this, we still have a lot of issues coming out of the Middle East. Would you agree? Yeah. Just a few. And there's reasons for it, and both sides have their arguments for it. And then last but not least, under Jimmy Carter, we have the Iranian hostage crisis. And what happened is the Ayatollah Khomeini, he will overtake, he was the religious ruler of Iran. And what he does is he starts a revolution because the United States was backing the Shah of Iran, who was a brutal dictator. But he wasn't a communist. And that's where we fell down sometimes. And because of this, when they overtake this embassy, they basically held these hostages for 444 days. They will be released the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. But this was really soured people on Jimmy Carter. Also the fact that inflation was around 18% and stuff. It was disgusting, and kind of what we're going through right now. And yeah. Anything else for you? And basically, this is going to end Jimmy Carter right here. But at the end of his presidency, basically, the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan. You can't make this stuff up. They invade Afghanistan, so we say, hey, we want to get the Soviets their own Vietnam. So we're going to support the Afghanis and their fighters become the Taliban eventually. And then what happens is, we support these rebels, including a man by the name of Osama bin Laden. We also boycotted the Olympic Games, and the Soviets were in Afghanistan for a long time, and then they had to leave because they failed. And then out of that came all of this chaos over there, and eventually led to 9/11. Can't make this stuff up.
Everything's connected to it.
All right, any questions for me? I know that was a lot of information. I'll hit some other things a little bit more in detail, but for now, that's just a really good idea of what's happened, through the Cold War.